To me, it was creating a sort of psychologically credible anarchist, a force of anarchy, a force of chaos, a purposeless. That is the most frightening form of evil. The enemy who has no rules, the enemy who's not out for anything, who can't be understood.
Every other section I list applies to the protagonist of your story, but this section is exclusively dedicated to the opponent. The antagonist of your story should be just as important, and in some stories can be even more important than the protagonist. But the villain of your story doesn't actually have to be villainous. The term villain actually isn't a very good term for your opponent, because this implies that the opponent is inherently evil. It is never a good idea to just make your opponent evil for the sake of being evil. Love story opponents, for example, are almost always a love interest. They are not the person who is mean. In Pride and Prejudice, the protagonist is Elizabeth Bennet, but the antagonist is Mr. Darcy. The opponent of a story should also have the same wants as your protagonist, but it doesn't necessarily have to mean that they want the same goal in the same way or for the same reasons. You may recognize that the relationship your antagonist has with your protagonist falls within the character web section of this workshop, and this is indeed true. The antagonist should have a stance on the theme of your story, just like the protagonist. Through the conflict of the protagonist and the antagonist battling over similar things, the antagonist should force the protagonist to overcome his weakness and learn a valuable lesson through the trials of facing his opponent. It is because of this, your opponent needs to not only be powerful, but also suitable. What do I mean by suitable? Consider Darth Vader, perhaps the best opponent of them all. But could you imagine if he was to square off with Elizabeth Bennet? I'm sure you'd just force choke her to death, and then the book would be over.
I find your lack of faith disturbing.
So your opponent needs to be a good fit for your main character. But Mr. Darcy is a perfect choice for Elizabeth Bennet. They both relate to the theme of Pride and Prejudice, which is Pride and Prejudice. Both of these characters experience Pride and Prejudice, but each in their own way, and by squaring off with each other, they each learn and overcome their weaknesses to make room for falling for each other. In this section, I will once again showcase two examples. One is a good example, one is a bad example of integrating a strong, suitable opponent in your narrative. This time, I'm going to stick with illusion-based thrillers.
Every magic trick has a third act. The hardest part. The part we call the prestige.
So who doesn't love Christopher Nolan? The Prestige is a movie about two friends who become rivals and repeatedly undermine each other in their performances. This is a rare movie in the sense that it's difficult to determine who is the protagonist and who is the antagonist. But because of this arbitration, the two characters are perfectly matched and equally determined. They both want the same thing, to perform the better trick. Borden Granted may be the more talented magician of the two, but Angier goes through a great transformation to get his hands dirty. Angier's choices place him at risk of losing everything in order to outperform Borden. The two characters are perfectly suited for each other as well. They are both talented magicians, and they both stem from the same path. It is because the two magicians have the same goal, but approach it in different ways, and that they are equally powerful and matched, but also in different ways, which is what makes this character pairing incredibly difficult to beat in storytelling. When your antagonist is strong and suitable for your hero, both the characters become stronger and grow from the high amount of conflict between them. But if the opponent is really not much of a threat, the character becomes lacking, which is exactly what happens in The Illusionist. The Illusionist is still a great movie. I love watching Eisenheim's magic performances, and there are still some really good scenes in the movie. This movie, however, was in great need for a strong opponent. Eisenheim is smart, talented, resourceful, and a trickster, whereas his main opponent, the Crown Prince Leopold, is unfortunately whiny and foolish. You could argue that Leopold has the power of royalty, while commanding the Venice police and the chief inspector Walter. However, even Walter is friendly to Eisenheim and is fair to our hero despite his loyalties being tied to the crown prince. Because of the movie's weak antagonist, you can tell that the character of Eisenheim is lacking. We never see him overcome any weakness in order to surmount his obstacles and become victorious. There isn't actually any character development that occurs. We're never afraid Eisenheim is in any real danger, and he remains one step ahead of the crown prince throughout the film. So keep in mind when crafting your story, ensure that the opponent is strong and suitable for the protagonist. Now we'll apply this section to your story. Consider the following questions. Think about the need or the want your hero has. What is their goal in the story? Now design an opponent that wants the same thing, but in a different way. Sometimes you need to think generically to discover how this will work. For example, in a superhero movie, the hero and villain both want a different version of the world that they live in. Then consider the weakness of the hero. How is the opponent familiar with this weakness? In what ways does the opponent attack your hero's weakness? Don't get too obvious with this, or it will come off preachy. Other things to think about. How does the antagonist feel about the theme or the moral argument of your story? Why do they feel this way? Think of what has happened to them to lead them to their sentiments.